Sarah Martinez had learned to hide her pain well. At 19, she'd perfected the art of long sleeves and careful positioning, always making sure the bruises stayed hidden from her co-workers at the diner. But today was different. Today, the words written in black marker on her white uniform sleeve told a story she couldn't keep inside anymore. "He hurt my brother again," the shaky handwriting read. She hadn't planned it. The marker had been sitting on the break room table, and in a moment of desperation, she'd grabbed it. Her 8-year-old brother, Danny, had shown up at her apartment the night before with a split lip and fear in his eyes. Their stepfather's drinking had gotten worse, and their mother seemed powerless to stop it. The Riverside Diner sat on Highway 287, a popular stop for truckers and travelers. But it was also a regular spot for the Bandidos Motorcycle Club's weekly breakfast run. Sarah had served them countless times over the past year, always polite, always respectful, but she'd never really paid attention to the patches on their leather vests or understood what they represented. Miguel Reaper Rodriguez was the first to notice. The club's sergeant-at-arms had sharp eyes for details, a skill that had kept him alive through 2 tours in Afghanistan and 15 years in the club. As Sarah refilled his coffee, the sleeve of her uniform caught his attention. The words were smudged, but clear enough. He didn't say anything at first, just watched as she moved between tables with practiced efficiency. But something in her movements, the way she kept her head down, the careful way she carried herself, told him this wasn't just teenage drama. If you've ever witnessed someone silently crying for help, hit that subscribe button and let's dive deeper into this story. Miguel caught the attention of his brothers with a subtle gesture. Tank, the club's president, followed his gaze to Sarah's sleeve. The massive man with graying temples had seen enough domestic violence cases during his years as a police officer before joining the club full-time. The message wasn't just words, it was a desperate plea written by someone who'd run out of options. "You see what I see?" Miguel asked quietly, as Sarah disappeared into the kitchen. Tank nodded grimly. The Bandidos had a code that went beyond their patches and colors. They protected their community, especially those who couldn't protect themselves. It wasn't about playing hero. It was about being the shield between predators and the innocent. When Sarah returned to refill their water glasses, Tank spoke up in his calm, measured voice. "Miss, you got a minute to talk?" She froze, her eyes darting to her sleeve, suddenly aware of what she'd written. Fear flashed across her face, not of them, but of the consequences of her silent cry for help being heard. "I'm not in trouble, am I?" she whispered, glancing toward the manager's office. Tank shook his head, his expression softening. "No, darling, but maybe we can help with whoever's causing you trouble." The kindness in his voice broke something loose in Sarah's chest, and tears she'd been holding back for months threatened to spill over. She looked around the diner, checking for her manager, then quickly sat down at the edge of their booth. "I don't know what to do," she admitted, her voice barely audible. "He's getting worse, and my mum won't leave him. My little brother. He's just a kid." The words tumbled out like water through a broken dam, and the bikers listened with the patience of men who understood that sometimes talking was the first step toward healing. Sarah's story unfolded in whispered fragments between her trips to other tables. Her stepfather, Rick Coleman, was a construction foreman with a reputation for having a temper even when sober. When he drank, which was most nights now, he became something else entirely. Their mother, Linda, had been with him for 3 years, and the violence had escalated slowly, methodically. At first, it was just yelling, Sarah explained, her hands trembling as she spoke. Then he started pushing her around. Mum kept saying he was just stressed about work, that things would get better. But things hadn't gotten better. They'd gotten worse, especially for Danny, who reminded Rick of Linda's ex-husband, Sarah's father, who died in a car accident 5 years earlier. Tank asked careful questions, his training evident in how he gathered information without making Sarah feel interrogated. The family lived in a trailer park on the outskirts of town. Rick worked for Morrison Construction, drove a red Ford pickup, and had no criminal record, which meant the police had never been called, despite the escalating violence. Last week, he threw a beer bottle at Danny because he was watching cartoons too loud, Sarah continued, her voice breaking. Cut his forehead. Mom told the school nurse he fell off his bike. The bikers exchanged glances. They'd heard similar stories before, seen how domestic violence escalated, knew how often it ended in tragedy when no one intervened. Miguel leaned forward slightly. "Sarah, what you wrote on your sleeve, that took courage. Most people suffer in silence until it's too late." He paused, choosing his words carefully. "We're not vigilantes, but we are protectors. There are ways to handle this that don't involve anyone getting hurt unnecessarily." Sarah looked into his eyes and saw something she hadn't seen in a long time. Hope, mixed with the promise of action. After Sarah's shift ended, she met the bikers in the parking lot behind the diner. Tank had called in 2 more members: Diesel, a former social worker who specialized in family crisis intervention, and Phoenix, whose day job was managing a shelter for domestic violence survivors. The Bandidos weren't just a motorcycle club. They were a collection of men with diverse skills and a shared commitment to protecting their community. Diesel explained their approach carefully. "We don't just roll up and threaten people, Sarah. That usually makes things worse for the victims." He'd seen too many cases where well-meaning intervention had escalated violence. "We gather information first, create a safety net, then apply pressure in ways that give families options, not ultimatums." Phoenix had already made calls to contacts at Child Protective Services and the County Sheriff's Department. "Your brother's safety is the priority," he told Sarah. "But we also want to create a path for your mother to leave safely when she's ready." They explained how domestic violence worked psychologically, how victims often needed multiple attempts before successfully leaving their abusers. The plan was methodical. They would document Rick's behavior, create evidence trails, and establish safe houses if the family needed to leave quickly. Miguel would use his connections to monitor Rick's work schedule, while Tank would coordinate with law enforcement contacts who understood the club's community protection role. "This isn't about revenge," Tank emphasized. "It's about creating consequences for Rick's actions and safety for your family." Sarah felt something she hadn't experienced in months: the sensation of not being alone in her fight. These men, with their leather vests and intimidating appearances, were offering her something more valuable than violence. They were offering her hope wrapped in a carefully constructed plan that prioritized her family's safety above all else. The Bandidos' approach began subtly. Rick Coleman's routine was predictable: work until 5, stop at Murphy's bar for drinks, home by 8:30, when the real trouble usually started. Miguel and Tank positioned themselves at Murphy's the next evening, not to confront Rick, but to observe and be seen. Their presence was deliberate but non-threatening, 2 bikers having a quiet drink and conversation. Rick noticed them immediately. The Bandidos' reputation in the county was well established. They weren't troublemakers, but they weren't people you wanted to cross either. When Rick asked the bartender about them, he learned they were regulars who kept to themselves but had strong opinions about men who hurt women and children. Meanwhile, Phoenix had connected Linda Martinez with a domestic violence counselor who specialized in safety planning. The approach was careful, presented as a community resource rather than an intervention. Linda was resistant at first, defending Rick and minimizing the violence, but the counselor was patient, planting seeds rather than demanding immediate action. Sarah reported that Rick seemed agitated when he came home that night, muttering about bikers at Murphy's and asking Linda strange questions about who she'd been talking to. But for the first time in weeks, he didn't drink himself into a rage. Instead, he went to bed early, leaving Danny unharmed and the house peaceful. The next day, Diesel visited Morrison Construction on the pretense of inquiring about a job. He spoke with Rick's supervisor about workplace safety and community partnerships, casually mentioning the Bandidos' involvement in local family support programs. The message was subtle but clear. Rick Coleman was on their radar, and his behavior was being noticed by people who cared about his family's welfare. If you're invested in seeing how this story unfolds, drop a comment below about your thoughts on community protection. Rick's paranoia grew over the following week. The bikers seemed to be everywhere: at the gas station where he filled up his truck, at the grocery store where Linda shopped, even riding past the construction sites where he worked. They never approached him directly, never made threats, but their presence was constant and unmistakable. The psychological pressure was intentional and effective. Rick began drinking more, but his violence decreased as his fear increased. He started asking Linda questions about her daily activities, checking her phone, and demanding to know if anyone had been asking about their family. His control was slipping, and everyone in the household could feel the change. Sarah noticed the difference immediately. Danny came to school without new bruises, and their mother seemed less jumpy around the house. But Sarah also recognized that this was a dangerous time. Cornered abusers often escalated their violence before they retreated. The Bandidos had warned her about this possibility and had contingency plans in place. The breaking point came on a Friday night when Rick, drunk and paranoid, accused Linda of bringing those bikers into our business. He grabbed her arm hard enough to leave marks and screamed at Danny to stop crying. But this time, instead of cowering, Linda looked him in the eye and said something that surprised everyone. "They're not here because I called them. They're here because people are watching what you do to us." Rick's rage turned to confusion, then to fear as he realized the implications. His violence hadn't been as hidden as he thought. People were paying attention, people with the power and willingness to hold him accountable. For the first time in years, Rick Coleman felt the weight of consequences pressing down on him, and the sensation terrified him more than any direct confrontation ever could. The direct encounter finally came on a Tuesday evening at Murphy's bar. Rick had been drinking heavily, trying to work up the courage to handle the biker situation once and for all. When Tank and Miguel walked in, Rick's liquid courage pushed him toward a confrontation he wasn't prepared for. "You got a problem with me?" Rick slurred, approaching their table with the aggressive swagger of a drunk man trying to prove his dominance. Tank looked up calmly, his massive frame still seated but somehow commanding the entire room's attention. "Sit down, Rick. Let's talk like adults." The invitation wasn't a request. Rick found himself sitting across from two men who radiated controlled power, their calm demeanor more intimidating than any shouting match could have been. Tank spoke first, his voice quiet, but carrying the weight of absolute certainty. "We know about Linda. We know about Danny. We know about Sarah working extra shifts to pay for her brother's school clothes because you spend the grocery money on beer." Rick's bravado crumbled as the specifics piled up. These men knew everything: his work schedule, his drinking patterns, his family's financial struggles, even details about incidents he thought no one had witnessed. Miguel leaned forward slightly. "Here's what's going to happen, Rick. You're going to get help for your drinking. You're going to keep your hands to yourself. And you're going to start acting like a man instead of a coward." The conversation lasted 20 minutes, but it felt like hours to Rick. There were no threats of violence, no dramatic ultimatums. Instead, there was something far more powerful: the absolute certainty that his behavior was being monitored by men who had the resources, connections, and commitment to protect his family from him if necessary. 6 months later, Sarah Martinez no longer needed to write desperate messages on her uniform sleeve. Rick Coleman had enrolled in an alcohol treatment program and anger management classes, not out of sudden enlightenment, but because the alternative, losing his family and facing the continued scrutiny of the Bandidos, was unacceptable to him. The change wasn't perfect or immediate. Rick struggled with sobriety, relapsed twice, and still had moments of verbal aggression. But the physical violence stopped completely. The knowledge that his actions were being watched by people who would hold him accountable had fundamentally altered the family's dynamics. Danny Martinez was playing Little League Baseball now, his bruises replaced by grass stains and scraped knees from sliding into bases. Linda had started attending Al-Anon meetings and was slowly rebuilding her sense of self-worth. Sarah had saved enough money to start community college classes, her dreams no longer derailed by family crisis management. The Bandidos continued their regular breakfast runs to the Riverside Diner, but now Sarah greeted them with genuine smiles instead of hidden desperation. Tank would ask about Danny's baseball games, Miguel would inquire about Sarah's studies, and Phoenix would slip Linda information about job training programs and educational opportunities. This story isn't about vigilante justice or dramatic rescues. It's about community protection, about men who understood that sometimes the most powerful intervention is simply letting someone know they're not alone in their struggle. The Bandidos didn't save Sarah's family through violence. They saved them through presence, persistence, and the promise that someone was watching, someone cared, and someone would act if necessary. Real protection isn't about dramatic confrontations. It's about creating safety through community accountability. If this story moved you, hit that like button and share it with someone who understands that sometimes heroes wear leather vests and ride motorcycles, protecting those who can't protect themselves.